My name is Christine Gardiner, and this is Investigative Poetics, Episode 2, Above the Fold. It was not so long ago, and in another lifetime, that the news was tangible, a physical artifact, something that dirtied your fingers with newsprint. The newspaper was definite and disposable, concrete, a physical artifact, a daily record. When I was growing up, my father read the paper as a ritual. I remember walking with him to the newspaper box at the intersection on Saturday mornings when I was just a little child. We would pass by the white house with the white fence, and when we got to the corner, he would palm a few quarters into my hands. I would feed them into the slot and pull open the door so my father could reach in, grab the paper, and scan the headlines. Back home, I looked at the comics while Dad sat with a cup of coffee, spread the pages over the kitchen table, and read the paper deliberately and by sections. This was how he marked the beginning and the end of each day. The local paper was the closest thing he had to a religion. The morning after my father pulled the trigger, his suicide was on the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer, his face and name displayed above the fold. At the time, I was out west in Colorado, a graduate student in the English department of the University of Denver, where most of my waking hours were devoted to the practice of textual creation or the act of literary analysis. So I maintained a cold, critical distance from the story as it unfolded back home in Philadelphia, where newspapers were delivered in plastic sleeves to people's doorsteps and stacked beside the cash registers at supermarkets and gas station convenience stores. The morning after my father died, the phone rang before dawn, and I sprang out of bed. "Oh my God, are you okay?" It was Ashley, my closest childhood friend. Her voice was high and alarmed. "My dad went out for coffee and saw the news," she said. "Why didn't you tell me?" In my mind's eye, I saw her father physically recoil from my father's face in the paper. I imagined the words drumming like artillery across the front page. "I'm fine," I heard myself say. The words sounded slow and detached, as though I were half asleep or underwater. "When are you coming home?" she asked. "Do you want me to meet you at the airport?" "I think I'm going to drive," I said. "What do you mean?" she asked. "Well, I'm going to be home for the summer, so I'll need the car." This was half true. The other half was that in the last conversation we would ever have, my father had told me it would be better to drive home. It was his final directive, and I wanted to honor his wishes. But this was all too intimate and complex to articulate. Also, the drive would give me something to do, would put space and time between my body and the finality of my father's act. "What about the funeral?" she asked. "Well, it's going to be at least a week until the funeral," I said, omitting the fact that this had to do with the coroner holding the body. "Well, you can't drive alone," she said. "Do you want me to come back and drive with you?" So within an hour it was decided. Ashley had booked a plane ticket. Her flight would get in the next day, and she would drive with me across 7 states and 1,700 miles from Denver to Philadelphia. When we hung up, I silenced my phone, opened my laptop, Googled my father's name, and read the news. Brien Gardiner, charter school pioneer under federal investigation, commits suicide. Brien N. Gardiner, the former darling of Philadelphia's charter school movement who fell from grace amid financial scandal, shot himself to death yesterday in the parking lot of a regional rail station, police said last night. Police confirmed that Gardiner died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound shortly before 1:30 p.m. The embattled Gardiner, 63, was the subject of an active federal probe related to his management of the Philadelphia Academy Charter School, a Northeast Philly school that he founded in 1999. It was a complex and shameful obituary, the culmination of a scandal that had played out on the front page for over a year. A series of investigative reports had revealed that my father had built a network of charter schools, consulting companies, and shell nonprofits by which he had systematically stolen hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars from the Philadelphia Academy Charter School and the School District of Philadelphia. For years, he had siphoned funds earmarked for the education of children through a complex scheme of contracts, land deals, and inflated rents. The articles had confirmed what I had always known in my heart, but had never been able to prove. My father was a fraud. He was a fraud, but he was also my father. So I felt for him, pitied him really when the news broke and he became the headline. Not because he was being unfairly persecuted or wrongly defamed. If anything, the articles treated him fairly, consistently referencing his decades of service and good reputation, but because he had few interests beyond networking and reading the paper. Now he had been stripped of his title and could no longer work, and his disgrace was front-page news. There was no solace anywhere, least of all in the paper. In a way, it was poetic, the way justice always and never is. I read one article after another. Quote, sources with knowledge of the investigation said that indictments were imminent, and an internal report alleged that Brien Gardiner and his associate, Kevin O'Shea, had systematically looted the school for personal gain. The report said that more than $700,000 was missing from a school account and cited substantial evidence of wrongdoing by Gardiner, a former public school principal, and O'Shea, a former police officer. In the next breath, the story expressed words of care and condolence. Before founding the charter school, it said Gardiner was a popular principal at Farrell Elementary School in the Northeast. He was so well regarded that staff and many families followed him to the Philadelphia Academy. Last night, members of the charter school community expressed shock and sorrow over Gardiner's death and recalled him as a trailblazer and pioneer in the charter community. These words struck me. Linguistic markers of colonialism, trailblazer and pioneer imply conquest. The words themselves are part of a lexicon of domination and social control. Another article said that through his work, Gardiner contributed to the lives of countless children in the school system. But I wondered, what did he contribute? What was his legacy? This is a real tragedy, the article went on to say. I hope that people can remember the great things he did. Of course I remember. He was my father. I remember everything. We are extending prayers to his family, one of the articles concluded. There was irony and magnanimity in this statement. I was his closest family, his eldest daughter, his favorite, and I felt certain I was not deserving of public prayer. After finishing the article, I made the mistake of scrolling through the comments. Amid words of bitter disappointment and incredulity were other words like boom, good riddance, piece of trash. That's when I learned, never read the comments. On Facebook, I received a message from a high school acquaintance asking if I imagined that before shooting himself, my father had thought about throwing himself on the tracks in front of a passing train. No, I hadn't thought of that until now. I blocked him, but I couldn't block out the question. Couldn't stop thinking about the coroner, suicide, natural death, and death ruled as an accident. A few weeks before my father pulled the trigger, he had nearly overdosed on insulin. He had recently been diagnosed with diabetes. Dad had always loved sweet things, donuts, bagels, cookies, ice cream, and he'd always been heavy, but the stress of public scrutiny was too much for his system. In the wake of the media coverage and the federal probe, he ate for comfort because there was nothing else to do. Towards the end, his belly was as big as a bear's and his skin was thick and ash pink. One evening, he locked himself in the bathroom for over an hour, and when he finally came out, he was stumbling and slurring his speech. My stepmother, Darlene, called 911. Hospital blood tests confirmed extreme hypoglycemia, and the doctors concluded that he had accidentally mixed up his dosage. But I suspected that the only accident was that he had ended up in the hospital instead of the morgue. He was hospitalized for several days before coming home sheepish and depressed, with drug facts printed out in big letters. After that, Darlene monitored his injections, and Dad withdrew further and further into himself. It was around this time that my mother found the note. It had been 10 years since the divorce, but my mother had never moved on, and my father still had the key to the house. One evening she came home from work and found an envelope on the kitchen counter. It was a handwritten letter about how sorry he was, how she deserved better, how proud he was of the children. I know what it said because my mother called to read the letter to me over the phone. How many spurned women ever receive such vindication, she asked. It's a death note, Mom, I said. Of course not, she said. How can you say such a thing? I couldn't choke out a response, so I swallowed the truth. What I'd been trying to say to anyone who would listen for over a year. He'll kill himself before he goes to prison. Since the news first broke, my family had spoken very little about what was going on in the press or in the courts. We were a broken Irish Catholic family, and repression, guilt, and denial were part of our heritage. We operated by a code of silence, following a complex and arcane set of unspoken rules. As my father simultaneously tried to maintain control of the narrative and put his affair in order. Now he was dead, and the family was speaking, not about what had happened, but about what would happen next. We were in constant contact, but the conversation amounted to a terse exchange of information about travel plans and funeral arrangements. My father's body, which had not yet been released from the coroner, was to be cremated. A funeral mass was arranged. I was on autopilot, operating by instinct. I composed short, formal emails to my professors, my supervisor, the department chair, saying that my father was dead, that I was going to Philadelphia, that I would submit my end of term work remotely. I felt everything: anxious, vindicated, empty, and nothing. My friends took turns watching over me. They traveled great distances to stay with me day and night, helping me pack, clean, and ready the apartment for sublet. They were sympathetic and wholly present. My friend Miriam sat beside me while I went through my closet and sorted my clothes. She held my hand and told me it was safe to cry, but my effect was glacial. I felt vast, cold, and sublime. I was very calm, but not entirely rational, and I insisted that she take home armloads of clothing that didn't fit her and that she would never wear, including a sea green crushed velvet dress that I had worn to my junior prom. She cleaned the refrigerator, I scrubbed the tub, Together we emptied the dresser, drawers, and carried boxes to storage in the laundry room. I kept checking the internet and reading the news. I was grateful for the clear factual account of what had happened, and I noted small inaccuracies in the reporting, tiny tears in the narrative fabric of reality. It's interesting what the mind latches on to. I remember one article stated Gardiner's body was found not far from his black Mercedes-Benz. But my stepsister Stephanie told me that Dad had driven the Volvo to the train station that day, and I believed her. To the end, he was calculating costs, and it wasn't like him to do anything to diminish the resale value of the Mercedes. Another news report said, quote, Gardiner lived with his wife and children, including a 2-year-old son. The statement was mostly true. He did live with Darlene and her 3 children, whom he adopted. But the baby was a 15-month-old girl, our half-sister, Leah. The calls and messages kept coming. I spoke to my family and closest friends. The rest of the time I answered the phone and refused to answer the phone as I liked. I didn't even tell my boyfriend Burkhan what had happened until he called to check up on me and started casually chatting about his laboratory experiments. My dad died, I said bluntly. What do you mean? He killed himself. There was an edge of cruelty in my voice. Part of me wanted to punish him for not knowing, for not calling until now, for living so far away, for not reading my mind. Are you kidding me right now, CG? No, I said. He shot himself. Oh my God, he said, what can I do? What do you need me to do? My mother is calling on the other line, I said. Another part of me wanted to protect him from what I knew and the darkness that consumed me. I have to go. It was easier to take the next action step than it was to slow down, to think, to see the big picture. So I kept my head down and I did what needed to be done. I made sure the bills were paid. I scrubbed the kitchen sink, vacuumed assiduously, left a key and detailed notes for the subletter, filled the gas tank, checked the air pressure in the tires, drove to the airport to pick up Ashley, and hit the road. She sat beside me in the passenger seat, adjusting the music levels as I navigated the plains of western Kansas. I was in the throes of catastrophe, so focused on where I was going and how I would get there that I couldn't see anything else. In Missouri, Ashley had to remind me that we needed to eat. So we stopped at an Arby's, where I forced down some waffle fries and ginger ale. Then we were back on the road. Night fell. I remember an endless tunnel of dark highway over which my mind projected my father's last moments. I imagined him driving to the train station, parking close to the tracks. I could almost see his thick red wrist as he reached for the gun. I tried to summon tears, but they wouldn't come. At midnight, Ashley insisted that we stop somewhere to sleep. We stayed in a motor hotel off the highway and left the next morning at dawn. I drank coffee and watched the miles tick away as we drew closer and closer to Philadelphia, to the place I was from, to the place I was ashamed to return. My anxiety mounted as the landmarks and signposts grew increasingly familiar. Mile by mile, turn by turn, I drew closer and closer until I pulled into my mother's driveway, and I was home, back at the scene of the crime. Those first days home were a blur. When I look back, only one moment is in clear focus. The moment I went to pay my respects to my stepfamily. They lived across town in a Tudor-style house with 4 bedrooms and an in-law suite, located just over the Philadelphia line. My stepsister Stephanie met me at the door with tears in her eyes, and Molly, the sweet, aging black lab, pressed against my legs. The grandfather clock loomed in the hall. Darlene and her sisters were gathered at the kitchen table. My stepbrother, Nathaniel, who was 16, stared blankly into the computer screen, and Christian, who was 17, was anxiously pacing the yard. The baby was sleeping upstairs. Steph led me into the dining room, where she had arranged photos of my father into a series of poster board collages. "He looks so happy," she said. My eyes glazed over as I looked at the pictures. Yes, in the photographs my father was smiling, but he didn't look happy to me. He looked red in the face, bloated, gloating, grimacing, self-important, self-sabotaging, big, small, gangster, pretending. My father. The complexity of his face stunned me. In the kitchen, Darlene and I exchanged a brusque embrace. Her features were drawn tight with worry, but even in her grief, she was unusually pretty, and the diamond heart she wore on a gold chain flashed at her throat. She offered me a cup of tea and turned away to put a mug of water in the microwave. "Do you want milk in your tea?" "No, thank you," I said. She handed me the pale yellow mug filled with weak tea, and we sat around the table like a bereaved family. "I can't believe it," someone said. "He was under a lot of pressure," someone else said, "but I thought he was holding it together." "Did he leave a note?" I asked. "No," Steph said tearfully. "He didn't say goodbye." "He called me that morning," I said. "He told me he was going into the city to meet with his lawyer, but he must have been on his way to the train station." I didn't mention the note he had left for my mother. To do so seemed inexplicably cruel. There was a long silence. "Where did he get the gun?" My voice, barely a whisper, cut through the room. Eventually, Darlene said, "He bought it last week." "There were receipts," Stephanie said. "He bought it the day before he died." The tone in the room suggested that the time for questions was over and that it was time to move on. Upstairs, the baby started to cry, and Darlene disappeared into the foyer. The family sat quietly at the table, and I looked blankly around the room. Dad's slippers were on the floor in the living room, next to his big leather chair, imprinted with the shape and weight of his body. His picture was on the bookshelf by the hearth. My father was everywhere, but he wasn't there. Darlene reappeared holding the baby. Leah was red in the face and still whimpering. "She doesn't understand what's happening," Darlene said, stroking her hair. Everyone said the baby resembled my father, but I knew better. With her red blonde curls and blue eyes, Leah looked just like me. I excused myself to the bathroom. My hands were shaking so violently that I struggled to close the door behind me. I looked in the mirror. My eyes were bloodshot and my face was flushed. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My whole body was racked with something between terror and grief, but it was as if someone had cut out my voice. I kept trying to scream, but there was no release, just a high-pitched hiss of air. Then I was on my hands and knees, heaving. Drool hung from my mouth and pooled on the floor. I sobbed like that for a long time, ugly, isolated, and inconsolable, until the grief recoiled like a snake within me and I was able to stand. Then I washed my face, inspected myself in the mirror, steadied my gaze until my eyes were as placid as a mask. Then I went back into the kitchen and sat with my stepfamily at the table. For another half an hour we made small talk, but no one mentioned the latest headline. The newspaper said that despite his suicide, Gardiner case will continue. Though Brien Gardiner ended his life Wednesday afternoon, the investigations into his alleged financial looting of the Philadelphia Charter School are still on track. Basically, the investigation is continuing, Jack Downs, the school's district inspector general, said yesterday. It's not done. It was terrifying to know that even though the worst had already happened, the story wasn't over. And in order to get through to the next moment, we all had to maintain appearances.